The conclusion that I have gathered from this book is that straight people are not okay. Welcome to my annual tradition of sharing the worst books that I have read this year. This list is not necessarily like the worst books ever. They just happen to be the worst among the books that I had read this year. They're a little bit different compared to previous years because a lot of them are nonfiction. Because I always want to expand my mind with new perspectives. And while there have been a lot of great books that I did learn from, specifically when it came to disability rights and social justice, there were also some flops along the way, which is bound to happen, and that's what I get for trying new things. But don't let that dissuade you, because a much more effective way of learning something new is taking lessons through LiveXP, which is the sponsor of today's video. I've talked about them before, and they're a great platform for learning new languages. 2025 is the perfect time to pick up a new skill, especially when you think about all the books that you could read in their original languages or the cultures that you could understand more. Personally, I've always found it difficult to learn a new language by myself because if I don't get real human interaction when I'm practicing, it's not actually going to stick with me in the real world. So what's cool about LiveXP is that they give you private one-on-one lessons in over 30 languages. That includes even my own family language, which is Vietnamese, and that's just something that I rarely ever see on other platforms. They have over 2,000 tutors from all over the world, including native speakers, and they're all included in one subscription, which means that you could learn from multiple tutors and multiple languages simultaneously, and you could even switch between different tutors as well. So if you're interested in new opportunities for the new year and growing as a person and seeing the world in a whole new way, I have an offer where you can book a 30-minute trial lesson for only 99 cents with my link down below and any subscription for a 30% discount with my promo code readwithcindy30. So thanks again to LiveXP for sponsoring, and now let's get into the worst books that I read in 2024. The way that I'm going to rank these is from least bad to most bad. So the first book that I want to talk about is More, which is a memoir about open marriage, and I might even do like a separate video about it just to go into detail all of the cuckoo misadventures that this woman has been through and has deluded herself into believing that this was something that she wanted to do and not something that her husband has coerced her to do. She also calls herself poly, which I don't think is the accurate term for that. And if anything, I think that how this book was handled and the things that she was describing would give a bad reputation for actual poly people, because this fulfills all the stereotype that poly people have to deal with. So the setup for how this even happened was basically the author is a mother of 2 children. So one time her husband missed the kid's bedtime and she was like angry about it. So she storms out of the house to clear her head, and then she ends up running into a friend. She gets drinks with that person, and then she meets this guy who is this hot younger man, and they kind of have like this flirtationship going on. So when she tells her husband that this hot young guy had asked her out, he actually encourages her to accept the offer and go out with him. So that's pretty lucky for her that her husband ended up being very chill with the idea of opening up their relationship. Now my question is, if you had been interested in another dude, but then you found out that your husband has a kink for imagining you being with other men, were you actually interested in opening up your relationship, or were you tempted to cheat, but then you kind of got lucky with the fact that your husband was a pervert? This was a question that I wondered as we went deeper into the story, because as they decide to open their relationship and she's seeing this other dude and it's going well, then the husband is like, my ex-girlfriend is in town, maybe I can hang out with her again and see where things go. Her reaction to hearing about this is like this gut-wrenching drop of her heart, because she doesn't like the idea of him hanging out and sleeping with his ex-girlfriend, but she feels like it wouldn't be fair for her to say no because he had allowed her to accept a date with this other guy. And so again, this is where I'm like, is it really opening a marriage if you were fine gallivanting out with other men, but you're not fine with your husband doing it? And also, what funny timing that he was so chill with you doing that, and now he brings up that his ex-girlfriend is in town. Very interesting. Things don't work out with the first guy that she was flirting with and had a relationship with, because he finds out that she and her husband had agreed to do an open marriage, and that was something that he was not aware of. Now, for all the poly bitches who are watching this video, correct me if I'm wrong, but I thought the whole point of being in an open relationship and being poly was that everyone consented. wanted. So the fact that this dude didn't even know that she had this kind of situation set up and he had to leave and break up with her as a result doesn't seem like that is part of like the thing that you guys do. And I also found it ironic that he was so disturbed by this that he decided to break up, because he apparently had his own girlfriend, and I would assume that she doesn't know that he was hooking up with the author, because he was evidently disturbed by the fact that her husband knew that this was going on. So he was like, whoa, I can excuse cheating, but I draw the line at the fact that this is a fucking open kind of situation. And the whole cheating thing is a very persistent theme throughout the book, because after she has the breakup with this guy that she cries over, she decides to go through these cycles of shitty hookups with these men that she finds from this website called Ashley Madison. It was basically a dating site where specifically married people go to in order to cheat on their spouses. And what's weird to me is that she had no self-reflection or remorse about her sleeping with cheaters and like not feeling bad for the other women that she was helping these strange men cheat with. So again, this does not seem like everyone was providing consent, and it also contributes to the negative stereotype that poly people have, that they just want to cheat. And this continues the theme of this lack of self-reflection on her part, that she never questions why was she seeking men that she would help cheat with. Why does she keep on stating in this memoir and positioning this open marriage as like this concept that allowed her sexual liberty, but meanwhile she's crying the majority of the book because of these hookups that don't actually give her any happiness or satisfaction, and the fact that she's jealous over her husband constantly sleeping with other women, and the fact that when they go to couples therapy and she says straight up in the therapy session that she wants to close the marriage, he tells her, you don't know what you want. You are just saying that because your recent hookups have not been good, but you're not giving it a fair shot. Am I crazy? Or is your husband gaslighting you and now you're trying to gaslight me as the reader, pretending that this whole open marriage thing was such a great decision that you guys did? There were some other things that I wrote down that weren't like the whole point of the book, but they kind of rubbed me off the wrong way. One of the things that you can tell that this is just some rich white lady who's deeply out of touch and has way too much money and free time on her hands is the fact that not only is she paying for hotel rooms and dinners and babysitters multiple times a week in order to arrange this kind of situation in the first place, she talks about food and fat people in kind of like a weird way that only skinny rich white women would be able to like talk about. Like she will mention a woman as being heavy set and how this woman will waddle away. Very strange choice of words. She would mention worrying about eating too much food, and it's like, what do you mean by eating too much food? What do you mean by that? When she was making her profile on the Ashley Madison site where you can hook up with people who are cheating on their spouses, she created this profile that was her Latina alter ego. And the quote that I found is, the twin sins of cultural appropriation and misrepresenting myself to men with Latina fetishes hardly seem important in the world of Ashley Madison. Mercedes Invierno is a badass. Straight A Molly's polar opposite. Within 24 hours of her debut on the online dating stage, Mercedes has gotten likes from over 100 nameless, nearly faceless men looking to hook up with a partner in crime. And she eats up the attention like a warm plate of churros. Yeah, so these are the kind of quotes that I'm gonna have to go through the book again and try to compile and give you like a play-by-play of everything that this weirdo does in a separate video, because what? Like, it's just so strange. The conclusion that I have gathered from this book is that straight people are not okay. And this is just what happens when you have too much money and free time on your hands. You go along with your pervert husband's kinks, and then you end up spending the whole book crying and pretending like you wanted this all along. But again, I put this as the first on my list of worst books because I will say, at least it was entertaining. Number 2 on my list is gonna be The Age of Magical Overthinking Overthinking. This was a nonfiction book from the same author of Cultish and Word Slut. These were both books that were about linguistics. I had enjoyed those two books, so I decided to pick this one up, and it's definitely the weakest out of the three. Pretty much because instead of having like a clear theme or a thesis to wrap the whole book around, this book was more like just a random disconnected string of pop psychology facts that truly didn't need to be a book. And I feel like the fact that this came out immediately after her previous two successful books came out, to me, this just seemed like a very quick, easy money grab for the author. Good on you for getting the bag, but let's raise our standards a little bit, okay, for what should constitute as a book. If something can be easily summarized in like 5 TikToks, then maybe it doesn't need to be a book in the first place. So this book is kind of like a combination of memoir. I say memoir very loosely because she does share some insights about her own personal life that I would argue is just as a way to kind of like fluff up the book a little bit more. She combines that with cultural criticisms of the cognitive biases that we have. The way that she defines magical thinking is the belief that your internal thoughts can affect externally that are unrelated to that. So things like how people will believe that they can manifest their way out of poverty, or that they can treat cancer with positivity. There are a lot of examples that she references in that, like the halo effect. So for example, associating pretty people as good people, which is what we often do with celebrities. There's the sunk cost fallacy, which is why a lot of people tend to stay in relationships that are not good for them because they've already invested so much time into it. She talks about confirmation bias, overconfidence bias, zero-sum bias, just a bunch of things that are essentially like psychology and sociology 101. It's very surface level, and I feel like the book would have been a lot better if it just focused on a few things instead of trying to cover a whole bunch of topics that lacked any depth. You're basically just quickly summarizing what these things are and then referencing like modern day examples like Taylor Swift, and as a result it ends up just being a bunch of disjointed essays. It very much is like TikTok level of the kind of education that you could learn. It wasn't interesting or memorable, and it just felt like a lazy cash grab. And so for number 3 of worst books, I am gonna combine 2 books because they're part of a series: Haunting Adeline and Hunting Adeline. I did a rant video for Haunting Adeline that was so long it had to be split into 2 parts. I did recently read Hunting Adeline, so I'm gonna have to do a separate rant video for that. I'm gonna try to condense it into one, but it is gonna be hard because that was also very ridiculous. So if you don't know the series, or if you just love me rehashing it, it is basically a dark romance book. It's about this woman who is an indie writer, and she inadvertently catches the attention of this hacker vigilante guy who wishes he was Luigi Mangione. All the love that the world has for Luigi Mangione is the same proportion as all the love that this guy in this book has for himself. He thinks that he is like this amazing dude who is doing so much for the world because he tracks down traffickers and pedophiles and he stops them from harming all these children and women. While it is a noble mission to have, the way that he goes about it is through these very tiring monologues about how he's doing so much good for the world and how the thought of all these children and women who are innocently being snatched up in random parking lots at grocery stores instead of like how trafficking actually works. All of these victims are so grateful to him, but they'll never know how his heart bleeds so much for their safety. It's very much like God complex and self-serving kind of charity that he does, and it's just really corny and tiring. Also, this book truly has no concept of how trafficking actually works, because the way that they describe these trafficking victims are just like random little Susie getting snatched up at like the parking lot of a Walmart or something, which yeah, I'm sure that does happen to people, but for most trafficking victims, a lot of it is due to family members who are exploiting these children and putting them in these dangerous situations. Or a lot of these are people who are in the foster care system, or people in poverty, or people who are homeless. Like, these are the vulnerable kinds of people that would end up in these situations. And so the fact that this book relies so heavily upon this man being a good guy because he is stopping trafficking from happening in the world, yet doesn't make any reflection on like the systemic issues that contribute to trafficking, there's such like a disconnect for me. I get that the reason why he has to do these things is to balance him out as a hero for the story, because throughout the book he's like stalking the main girl, and they're into like non-consensual consent, which means that like he'll break into her house, she'll say that she doesn't want anything to do with him, but he doesn't listen to her, and then he has his way with her. There's like a scene where he shoves a gun up her coochie and, you know, threatens her life. Regardless of what you could argue about the ethics of that and whether that's assault or maybe it's not because she apparently really wants it deep down and she's like turned on by it, like regardless of all of that, the fact of the matter is he's doing all of these heinous things, but it's okay because he saves trafficking victims. That's supposed to show the gray morality of this character, right? If you're really gonna lean so hard into the trafficking aspect, it feels almost insulting to depict trafficking in such like a shallow way. I have no problem with people reading whatever they want to get their rocks off of it. This is a kink that people are into. Even the main character is into this, and maybe readers who have been through trauma also take something out of enjoying this book as well. That's totally fine. Whatever. I don't care about this stuff. Really, what I'm complaining about is the corniness of the writing. That is the insult here. So don't get it twisted that I'm trying to yuck anyone's yum. I don't really care about the kinky stuff. What I care about is how fucking corny it is that this cheesy hacker vigilante going around snatching up any guy that gets close to the main character and kidnapping him and torturing him. Why is it that when he kidnaps the guy, he has to show up with a rose between his teeth and he leaves a rose behind for the main girl to see, like he's fucking Tuxedo Mask? The sequel, Hunting Adeline, is a whole new level of goofy that I will dive deeper in a separate video to give you a sneak peek of what to expect. It picks up from how the first book ended. If you don't want to know spoilers, just mute this video and turn off captions, but I'm gonna cover my mouth so you don't see. It ended with the main character getting snatched up and kidnapped by the traffickers, which makes no sense. She would not be the ideal trafficking victim at all. She has family, she has friends, she is an author, so she is somewhat of a public figure. That makes no sense with the kind of victims that would be trafficked, but whatever. Okay, so in the second book, she's trying to get out of a bad situation. You would think that this is like a great way to expand more on this character, show more of her life and her capabilities outside of this man. But instead, the whole time she's thinking, what would Zayd do? And the way that she's able to motivate herself into surviving is to just think about Zayd calling her a little mouse, because that's what they do when they're having their dirty talk. She calls him kitty cat and he calls her little mouse. And so she's thinking, Zayd is out there calling me little mouse and I have to survive for him. I'm like, girl, how about you step the fuck up and like have any kind of motivation that is not around your weirdo love interest. And the way that trafficking gets depicted in this sequel, believe it or not, is even goofier. They enter this weird game that the traffickers play that's kind of like the poor man's version of the Hunger Games. So like all of these women that are being trafficked, they gotta like run around some forest while the bad guys are like shooting arrows at them. And so the whole point is to like not get shot with arrows. You just have the new year to look forward to, where I expand more on the shenanigans of Hunting Adeline. I just put this in the middle of my list because I find the next two books to be more offensive because they were actually trying to be helpful. Whereas at least in this book, I think people can just get their rocks off of it and it's not gonna be like a big deal. I don't think that it's like harmful or problematic or whatever. I just think it's goofy. So number 4 on my list is gonna be Good Morning Monster. The author of this book is a therapist, and she shares 5 stories of memorable patients that she has treated before. So these patients have a wide variety of traumas and lives that they have survived. I was kind of into it in the beginning, but the more that I read, the more that I was like, this feels kind of off to me. The biggest thing that stood out to me was when we get to this story about the therapist handling her Native American patient. So his story was about his sexual abuse as a child, and specifically being Native American, there is another layer to this because you're forced into these schools, you're ripped apart from your family and your culture, and not only are you dealing with this school environment, but you're being abused by the adults in that school. And there was this one part where he was talking about the sexual abuse, and he was wondering why him? Why was it him among all of the boys in the sports team that he was in at the school? Why did the coach pick him to be abused? The therapist replied that perhaps it was due to his looks. He went silent, he stood up, and then he walked out of the room, as he should. But the therapist was like so confused why he just suddenly walked out. And so in the next session, they talk about how he was triggered by that, obviously, but it felt like she didn't acknowledge that it was wrong for her to say that. Instead, she made it seem like his reaction was just like disproportionate and just so strange because he was triggered. Actually, I feel like his reaction was proportionate regardless of the trigger. I would have walked the fuck out too, because why would you say that to a patient? There was almost like this tension between them because she was a white therapist and he was a Native American patient, and he constantly jokes about her being white. The way that she frames it, it makes it seem like banter, but in my mind, I'm kind of like, this guy probably is thinking, I hate this white bitch. The sad thing is, I don't think we will ever know, because it turns out that this guy passed away. That makes me wonder, apparently you got permission to write all these stories, but how did you get permission for this guy? Is it like free game now to share his story because he's dead? There was a part that I wrote down where she told him, did it ever occur to you that not all Native traditions are good, just like how not all white traditions are good? That was just so weird to say. To me, it felt more indicative of her being insecure of her position as a white therapist treating a Native American patient. And yeah, she should be insecure because clearly she doesn't know what the fuck she's talking about. The good thing is she did suggest that he seek spiritual Native healing just to compensate for her white therapy. So at least there was some self-awareness there with how culturally specific psychotherapy is. But there were just so many little comments that rubbed me off the wrong way, even though she positioned it to be banter. So she would say, I've never met anyone who looks more Native than you. And he would reply, I've never met anyone who looks as white as you. So she frames it as banter, right? Again, I'm thinking he probably hates this white bitch, and rightly so. And then as I kept on reading the other stories, so many of them were just so sad. It made me start to wonder, is telling these stories in such detail really helping people, or is it just exploitative in order for you to write your book and profit off of it and become a bestseller? Another story that I noted to be kind of iffy for me was this one patient who suffered so much trauma that manifested in what the author identified as dissociative identity disorder. Basically, this patient had a partner who is a transgender woman. And so when the author is introducing their relationship, she refers to the transgender woman by her dead name. And she also describes her transition using incorrect pronouns. And these were things that rubbed me off the wrong way, because you're describing the out-of-pocket shit that you just said to your Native American patient, and then you're also committing like these microaggressions in a book that you had all this time to edit and carefully choose your word selection selection and you decide to do this. It just seems very insensitive and irresponsible. There's a part where the patient ends her relationship with the transgender woman, and there's a dialogue that the author shares, which is supposed to show the anger that this patient feels towards her ex-partner and how this anger was like misdirected. And the dialogue was transphobic. Like, she said really hurtful shit to her transgender partner. I question whether it was necessary to write out this dialogue in the book. These are just the kinds of choices that really made me side-eye the author. The more that I think about the book, the more it feels like trauma porn, because you're making these decisions that I don't think were necessary. And I think just because you call these patients a hero for their stories of surviving trauma doesn't mean that you have the right to exploit their stories for profit and go into such detail about the tragedies that they've been through and include such hurtful messaging about their identities, whether that's like a transgender person or a Native American person or whoever. And I think it's very telling that this is a white woman therapist that is really mishandling describing other people who are not white or cisgender. And so the last book that I will say is the worst is a philosophy book called The Courage to be Disliked. The subtitle is How to Free Yourself, Change Your Life, and Achieve Real Happiness. What a peculiar subtitle to have, considering that some of the philosophy is that depression and trauma isn't real. And it's considered to be a Japanese phenomenon that teaches you these profound lessons about liberating your real self and finding your own happiness. Even though this was popular in Japan, the philosophy isn't related to any kind of Asian culture at all. It actually talks about theories of Alfred Adler, who was a 19th century psychologist alongside Freud and Jung. And it's also not applicable for the modern day age, nor is it applicable for people who are not white men who don't have any, disorders. And maybe there should be reflection for why it was such a big hit in Japan, which is a country that doesn't normally openly talk about the issues that they're dealing with. The argument in this book is extremely circular because it comes with this idea that people choose their emotions. You choose to be happy, you choose to be depressed in order to justify your goals. And you choose your goals because of fear. It's not really presenting anything deep or new. And I would argue that it's offensive because it's victim blaming and presenting harmful ideas that systemically people use in order to justify something being unjust or deeply messed up in the system that we live in. I'm putting this last on my list because I find all of these teachings to be super negligent and irresponsible, especially when there's literally scientific evidence that trauma does exist. And I think it's dangerous to get people to think that trauma doesn't exist and that you should just tough it out and you should just choose to be happy, because that's not going to help in the long run. It's going to mess you up in the long run. That's just another way that the same problems in this world are going to continue on and on because you're not addressing the root issue. Overall, it's just a very ignorant viewpoint, and I was very caught off guard by that. I totally did not expect the book to be regurgitating such antiquated viewpoints. So that pretty much summarizes the 5 worst books that I read this year. Who knew that nonfiction could get so spicy? And I don't mean spicy in a fun way. I mean spicy in a problematic way. Let me know what horrible books you read this year. And if you're not a reader, let me know which of these books that I had listed seem to be the most offensive to you. See you next time. Bye.